Have you ever noticed that some of the smartest people you know seem to quietly disappear from group life? They don't get angry and they don't complain. They just stop showing up as often, and somehow nobody questions it too closely. At first glance, it looks like arrogance, or maybe shyness, or simply a busy schedule that keeps them away. But there's something strange about how consistent this pattern is across people who have almost nothing else in common. You'll find it in the quiet engineer, the sharp-witted writer, and the analyst who leaves every party early. Once you recognize this pattern, it's almost impossible to ignore it again. Maybe you've experienced this yourself more than once without ever naming it. Maybe you've noticed that a room full of conversation leaves you more tired than a full day of solitary work. Maybe you've sat in a group and felt completely alone anyway, surrounded by voices that never quite reach you. Maybe you've been told you're too intense or overthinking it, when really you were just noticing something everyone else missed. Maybe you've quietly wondered if something is wrong with you for preferring your own company over almost anyone else's. You've been asking the wrong question this entire time. If you're enjoying this conversation, consider subscribing for more psychology explained simply. Here's what's surprising about all of this. Solitude, for a certain kind of mind, isn't a symptom of loneliness at all. What looks like withdrawal can actually be self-protection, carefully built over years of trial and error. What seems like coldness may actually be exhaustion from being deeply, involuntarily aware of everything happening around them. Psychology often shows something different from what we assume on the surface. The people who seem the most distant are frequently the ones processing the most information all at once, all the time, without ever asking to. Think about a coworker who says almost nothing in meetings, then later sends an email that quietly reframes the entire problem everyone else missed. On the surface, they look disengaged, maybe even indifferent to the discussion. Beneath that, they were listening at a depth the rest of the room couldn't match, tracking every inconsistency in real time. Our minds naturally filter conversation for efficiency, picking up tone, subtext, and unspoken tension long before the words even form fully. Many people unknowingly do this so intensely that ordinary small talk starts to feel like static on a radio. That's why silence for them isn't empty at all, but rather where the noise finally stops. At first, this might look like simple introversion, and sometimes it overlaps with it. Over time, though, a clearer pattern starts to emerge, one that has less to do with shyness and more to do with sheer mental bandwidth. In many cases, the exhaustion isn't caused by people themselves, but by the sheer volume of signals a sharp mind can't help but track. Every glance, every pause, every mismatch between someone's words and their tone gets registered automatically. Interestingly, this happens even when the person wishes it wouldn't, even when they'd rather just relax and enjoy the moment. Consider a family gathering where everyone else is laughing at a familiar joke, and one person is somewhere else entirely, turning over a completely different thought. It isn't rudeness, and it isn't disrespect for the people around the table. It's that their attention keeps drifting toward patterns, contradictions, and questions nobody else in the room is asking out loud.
The brain often treats novelty and complexity as more rewarding than repetition and comfort. In other words, a highly analytical mind gets less from familiar bonding rituals and more from unresolved ideas that refuse to sit still. That's not a flaw in the person, it's simply a different reward system running quietly underneath. Now think about friendship itself and how differently it can be built. Most people build friendships around shared activities, shared schedules, and shared comfort with routine. Highly intelligent people often build friendship around shared depth instead, and depth, it turns out, is rare. One common psychological pattern is that as cognitive complexity increases, the number of people who can match that complexity in conversation shrinks fast. This isn't about looking down on others, and it rarely feels like superiority from the inside. It's about a kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with being unliked and everything to do with being undermatched. But that's only part of the story. There's another layer that most people never notice, one that has less to do with other people and more to do with the self. The surprising part is that solitude isn't only a retreat from other people. It's often a retreat towards something, a return trip rather than an escape. Many highly intelligent individuals report feeling more like themselves when alone than in any social setting, no matter how friendly or familiar that setting is. We tend to assume that identity is built entirely through connection, and often it is. But for a certain kind of mind, identity is built through uninterrupted thought, and other people, however kind, interrupt that process constantly, sometimes without even realizing it. This is where things become even more interesting. Picture someone at a party, technically present, physically smiling, mentally already 3 steps into a completely unrelated idea. From the outside, this looks like disinterest, maybe even mild rudeness. From the inside, it's often relief, because their mind finally has room to move without interruption. The real reason is often hidden beneath the surface, and the surface is almost always misread as arrogance or emotional distance. Yet there's another detail that often goes unnoticed in all of this. Preferring solitude doesn't mean disliking people, and it rarely does. Many people who choose to be alone report genuinely caring, sometimes painfully so, about the people already in their lives. What they struggle with isn't affection itself. It's the emotional cost of constant social performance, the subtle pressure to soften their thoughts, simplify their language, or hide the intensity of what they're actually thinking in the moment. Eventually, performing that mask becomes more tiring than the isolation ever was. This becomes much clearer in everyday life once you know what to look for. Think about someone who avoids group chats, not because they dislike their friends, but because the endless notifications feel like static, interrupting a signal they were trying to hear. Think about the person who turns down invitations, not from arrogance, but because they know they'll spend the whole event managing everyone else's energy instead of resting their own. Surprisingly, this pattern shows up just as often in warm, empathetic people as it does in detached, guarded ones. In fact, sensitivity often makes solitude even more necessary, not less, because feeling everything intensely is exhausting on its own. Even romantic relationships carry this pattern, though it rarely gets discussed openly.
A highly intelligent person may deeply love their partner and still need long stretches of uninterrupted silence just to feel like themselves again. This isn't rejection, even though it can feel that way to someone on the receiving end. It's closer to a nervous system quietly asking for space to reset before it can fully show up again. Couples who understand this early tend to build relationships with far less resentment because the withdrawal stops being interpreted as a personal insult. There's a version of this that shows up in friendships specifically, one that often gets misread as coldness. A highly intelligent person might go weeks without initiating contact, not because the friendship stopped mattering, but because their attention was fully absorbed somewhere else entirely. When they do return, the depth of the conversation often picks up exactly where it left off, as if no time had passed at all. This confuses people who measure closeness by frequency of contact rather than quality of connection. Surprisingly, the two measurements rarely line up for a mind that treats depth as the real currency of intimacy. Something similar happens in group settings built around consensus. A team meeting designed to get everyone nodding in agreement can feel almost unbearable to someone whose instinct is to stress test every idea in the room. It isn't that they enjoy disagreement for its own sake. It's that surface-level agreement without real scrutiny feels like a wasted opportunity to actually solve the problem. Over time, this person learns to stay quiet in group settings and save their sharpest thinking for private conversations or solitary work instead. That's why so many breakthrough ideas arrive not in the meeting itself, but hours later, alone, once the social pressure has finally lifted. Even hobbies reveal this pattern if you look closely enough. Notice how many highly analytical people gravitate towards solitary pursuits: long-distance running, reading, chess, coding, painting, or writing late into the night. These aren't simply personal preferences picked at random. They're activities that reward sustained, uninterrupted focus, the exact condition that group environments rarely provide. In many cases, the hobby itself becomes a quiet form of self-regulation, a way of returning to baseline after a day spent translating thoughts for other people. Eventually, that private hour of focus becomes the most reliably restorative part of an entire week. Which brings us to something even more important than the pattern itself. Why does this happen in the first place, and where does it actually come from? This doesn't necessarily make someone a bad person, and it isn't a sign of superiority either, even though it can sometimes look that way from a distance. Often, it's simply the way they've learned to protect themselves over many years of small, repeated experiences. Childhood plays a bigger role here than most people expect. A child who is consistently misunderstood, whose questions are dismissed as too much, or whose depth makes adults visibly uncomfortable, learns something early and never really forgets it. They learn that being fully themselves in front of others carries a cost. Over time, solitude becomes the one place where that particular cost disappears completely. At the same time, attachment patterns shape this more than intelligence alone ever could on its own. Someone who grew up feeling emotionally unseen, even inside a loving and stable home, may associate closeness with the risk of being misread all over again. Interestingly, this isn't necessarily about trust in other people's intentions. It's about trust in whether connection will actually feel like connection, or just another exhausting performance to manage. Because of this, solitude starts to feel safer than the uncertainty of being known only incompletely. Shame plays a quieter, less obvious role too, one that rarely gets named directly.
Many highly analytical people were told, directly or indirectly, that their intensity made other people uncomfortable to be around. As a result, they learned to dial themselves down in company and only fully exhale once they were finally alone again. This is where everything starts connecting together into a single, coherent picture. The preference for solitude isn't really about avoiding people at all. It's about avoiding the specific discomfort of shrinking yourself just to fit inside a room. But psychology rarely stops there, even when it feels like it should. The deeper explanation is surprisingly simple once you sit with it for a moment. Solitude, for these individuals, becomes the only space where thought can move at full speed, without translation, without apology, and without waiting for anyone else to catch up first. The next time you notice yourself pulling away from a group, pause before assuming something is wrong with you. Ask yourself what you're actually moving toward in that moment, rather than only what you're leaving behind. Are you avoiding people, or are you returning to a version of yourself that only fully exists in quiet? More importantly, notice what happens in your body right before you withdraw from a conversation. Often it isn't dislike at all, but simply your mind quietly asking for room to breathe again. This awareness matters far beyond any single moment of choosing solitude over company. Even more revealing, the same pattern shapes how highly intelligent people choose relationships altogether, not just how they spend a Friday night. They tend to gravitate toward fewer, deeper bonds instead of wide circles, not because they can't sustain more connections, but because shallow connection now costs more than it gives back. In friendships, this shows up as a strong preference for honesty over surface-level harmony. In romantic relationships, it often shows up as a hunger for intellectual intimacy that matters just as much as emotional intimacy does. At work, this same pattern explains why capable people avoid open offices, avoid unnecessary meetings, and do their best thinking somewhere quiet, far away from everyone else. It isn't about being antisocial or difficult to manage. It's about protecting the one resource that makes their contribution valuable in the first place, which is uninterrupted depth of thought. Which explains why forcing constant collaboration on certain minds doesn't increase their output at all. It often quietly, invisibly destroys it instead. Even self-image is shaped by this pattern, sometimes for decades without anyone noticing. Many people who prefer solitude spend years quietly believing something is wrong with them for not wanting what everyone else around them seems to want so easily. Understanding this pattern doesn't excuse withdrawing from every relationship that asks something meaningful of you, but it does offer something gentler than self-criticism ever could. It offers an explanation instead of a quiet verdict handed down against yourself. Understanding people doesn't mean excusing every behavior, including your own choices and habits. Choosing solitude too often for the wrong reasons can still quietly become a kind of hiding from the world. But recognizing the difference between hiding and simply returning to yourself changes everything about how solitude actually feels. Sometimes awareness changes everything simply because it removes the shame that used to sit quietly underneath the choice all along. The greatest shift begins when invisible patterns finally become visible, and what once felt like a flaw slowly starts to look like a way of protecting something worth protecting. If this perspective helped you see something differently today, consider subscribing for more conversations like this one. Thank you for spending these moments with me. I'll see you in the next video.